Alrighty, so in this lecture, we're going to introduce Chapter 3, the MCAT. So like I formally endorsed previously, the MCAT is one of the first steps, I think, to applying to the medical school, at least one of the first steps you should consider before, formally applying to medical school. The reason being that it's pretty much the hallmark test that is like a very large gatekeeper to getting in to medical school. Like I said, the cornerstone of a student's application. So, this kind of takes priority before everything else, hence why it is at Chapter 3. So, one of the things I recommend prior to kind of getting your feet wet with the MCAT is to take a look at the MCAT Essentials Addendum. And this is something that's posted by the AAMC and AMCAS every single year. Then there's a most updated version. So, you can take a look at the QR code right there on the right-hand side, and you can basically link out and check out that resource. It's going to have a lot of good information about when you should apply, when you should set up and register for the MCAT, and that kind of resources you should consider. The pharmacy student struggle is essentially something I've introduced already as well, in which a lot of the content that is tested on the MCAT isn't really relatable to what we've learned in pharmacy. Now, of course, there's foundational principles like, basic biology, chemistry, and so on. But the problem with a pharmacy student taking the MCAT is a lot of that material is so far removed from our educational mind. In the sense that, what we're learning in our pharmacy curriculum is very, clinically focused on medications and pathology and disease identification and different guidelines and whatnot. Versus the content tested on the MCAT is very different. It's very superficial, and it reverts back to a lot of basic principles and then kind of builds off of those. So I find it, I call it the pharmacy student struggle, because it's very frustrating to go back and focus on some of this material that, from a clinical perspective, is rather irrelevant. And so, when I remember studying for the MCAT, and I was getting frustrated because I was thinking to myself, why do I need to learn all of this basic chemistry, or let alone organic chemistry principles, when I know for a fact that I'll never use that in clinical practice? So that's something that I think it was a mental barrier for me, was, accepting the fact that this was material that you will have to learn. So if you kind of come across that when you're studying for the MCAT, and you kind of appreciate the material you're learning, I think it can help dissolve some of those barriers or that resistance to learning the material in the first place, by acknowledging that it is actually important for the MCAT. So, I've already told you guys a little bit about my MCAT story and whatnot, but if this is the first time you're checking out any of these videos, then I'll just share that, I ended up taking the MCAT twice. The first time around, I didn't take it very seriously, and I didn't utilize a lot of the resources that I should have. I was also in pharmacy school at the time, and I was working full-time as a pharmacy intern at the hospital. So I was working 40 hours a week while trying to study during my P2 summer into my P3 year. And because of that, I didn't really take a lot of the practice exams and didn't follow much of the recommendations online. I just figured my pharmacy education was sufficient to make me perform on the exam. Hence, it did not go well. My second time around, I ended up taking a paid Princeton review course. And that course, I actually highly suggest students and non-traditional applicants consider using something like that, just because it made the whole process so much easier. Just like, you're using this course right now to kind of lighten the load and organize things. You pay what you get for a lot of these things. So I definitely recommend utilizing something like that. So, we'll cover a little bit more about the resources here. But so generally speaking, there's a lot of free resources available, and this includes like Khan Academy. Our MCAT is just referring to the Reddit subreddit for the MCAT, and there's a lot of good feedback. Is not a lot of it's verifiable per se, but just from like anecdotal students, sharing their experience about the MCAT, or recommendations and resources that you can utilize to prepare. And then Blueprint MCAT, also known as formerly as like Next Step. That's also a good resource. They usually have like a free exam that you can utilize or take advantage of. There's also the AAMC sample test, as well as Jack Weston CARS passages, and then of course Quizlet. And there's a few good Quizlets I recommend in my book as well that helps really hammer home some of the psych-soc concepts. And we'll kind of break down the MCAT some more in subsequent lectures, but this is more so just the introduction to some of these concepts. Some of the paid options include the Princeton Review course, which I mentioned, and they have different tiered systems. I'm not affiliated or sponsored by any of these particular programs. I just like to advocate for things that I utilized and I thought were very useful tools. The Princeton Review course, there's like a self-paced course, which is the cheapest option. That comes with all the books. It comes with like additional content, tests, online platform, as well as all the AAMC content. Now, a quick word about AAMC content. So this is essentially material that is created by the MCAT creators themselves. So it's sometimes old questions that they've utilized on past MCAT exams, or just content they've created that is supposed to like mimic the MCAT exam itself. So, a lot of these third-party test prep courses will try and do the same thing, but AAMC is like the golden nugget. Like, that's all the material that you absolutely must take to kind of get the closest representation of what the MCAT is actually like. So, they offer a bunch of practice exams. They have the sample test, which I mentioned is free. And they also have like section banks on particular questions, like biology, chemistry, and so on. So that AAMC content is non-negotiable. It is paid, but it's non-negotiable when it comes to preparing for the MCAT. Like, that is the bare minimum. I recommend you employ all of the resources that AAMC provides, because that's going to be the most, representative of the MCAT experience. Additionally, there's also a Kaplan. They also have their books. They're basically Princeton Review's competitor. UWorld is also an option that I've heard been utilized in the past, although I personally have not used UWorld. And I've also utilized Exam Crackers in the past, and they have a pretty good CARS passage booklet that I've utilized as well. But you can kind of explore the different options out there. I personally did the full-time thing with Princeton Review, so I really enjoyed my experience with them. So, I can only recommend what I've actually, used in the past. Another thing I didn't mention, too, on the free resources is there's also Anki cards, and that's more of a medical school concept. A lot of people use Anki for medical school, but it can be utilized to also prepare for the MCAT, especially with hammering home material. So that's something to also consider as a free option. And then real quick, the MCAT costs about $330, give or take a few dollars here and there. It tends to uptrend every single year, so just kind of pay attention to that. But there's also different criteria of when you sign up for the MCAT and register for it, which can also increase the price. So depending on what tier you are, like gold, silver, or bronze, the prices can change. And that's just based on how far in advance you actually schedule your MCAT exam. The further out you schedule it, basically the cheaper it will be. Versus, if you schedule it a month ahead of time, or even less than that, then they kind of charge you a premium for that privilege to take it such short notice. So that kind of covers the introduction to the MCAT and some of the resources that we're going to utilize. We'll kind of break down the MCAT specifics in the next subsequent lectures, but we'll kind of leave it at that for this quick introduction.